Hi, I'm Randy Wise, curator at the Fremont County Pioneer Museum. Welcome to our latest Wyoming Community Bank Discovery Speakers Series. Due to the unusual circumstances in the country this year, we're doing many of our programs digitally, and this is a digital program, and it is our speaker, Sam Lightner, who is doing part 2 of his talk on Wyoming history. Sam is a Lander author who has recently published Wyoming, A History of the American West, a terrific introduction to Wyoming history and Western history. He did part 1 last month. This is part 2 of his talk, and he is going to cover the Indian Wars up until the early 1900s tonight. So enjoy, and please join us for future online or live programming at the Fremont County Pioneer Museum.
Starting here with the second edition of Wyoming's history, and we're getting into really what is a lot of the meat of things. The railroad came about, and the railroad, as we talked about, was a function of the of trying to link the country. Really, for the Civil War was why it had to be done so quickly, and it did do that, which now meant the country truly was all one unit, with this area in the middle pretty much focused on Wyoming, where things were still a little bit wild. And one of the things that was wild by the white tribes' point of view was there were areas you just didn't go. And there were areas where you were probably okay, but there were areas that we had said, this is going to be. Back in the Treaty of 1851, we had said, this is going to be Lakota territory. This is going to be Shoshone territory. That wasn't actually in that treaty, but was in a follow-up treaty. This is going to be Crow, and so forth. And some of those tribes got along with the white tribes, and some of them did not, and saw encroachment taking place, and saw the bison population dropping. The resources they depended on were being crushed. One guy in particular who was not happy with the way things were going was Red Cloud. And Red Cloud was a Lakota chief who was reputed at midpoint in his life to have actually been in over 40 battles. And, of course, Indian battles were not just, there would be, bows and maybe guns fired, but there would also be hand-to-hand combat. And he was a very tough individual. But I think he can also go down in history as being a statesman. He was pushing for his own people's independence and didn't want anything to infringe on that, and that included other tribes. And this is an interesting point. The Lakota were new to the, let's call it the eastern slope of the Rockies, the Wyoming area. Not as new as the white tribe, but they really only arrived in the area around 1700, and probably moved in because they came in from, say, the Minnesota, Wisconsin area. The decimation of the population across the country from smallpox allowed a lot of movement. They got horses fairly early, and they became very good with the horses. So it was easy for them to move to areas where the pickings were good. Bison population was big. They found it out there and went, wow, this is going to be our spot. Well, there were already other tribes there that were smaller than the Lakota and didn't want them there. Among them was one of the prominent ones, two of them were the Kiowa, and who were a little bit further east generally than Wyoming. And important in Wyoming were the Crow. And the Lakota were moving in on their territory, northeastern Wyoming. Crow were a pretty small tribe. So these two became enemies, staunch enemies. And the Kiowa even disliked the Lakota so much that they refused to come to any discussion of treaties where the Lakota would be present. They, for instance, did not come to the 1851 treaty. They were just, if you're going to have a Lakota there, we're not coming. So these guys were not necessarily well liked. And what I'm trying to point out here is there was a division between the tribes before the white tribe came in. And often we look at the expansion into the West as an us and them thing. We tend to think in black and white terms. Well, there was these guys and there was these guys. There was white people versus Indian people, native people. No, they were a little bit broken up. And as the Lakota moved in, not only did they wind up putting pressure on the Crow, they also got in fights with the Shoshone. And they got in a few fights with the Cheyenne. But nevertheless, what happened in the late 1860s with Red Cloud's War, as we now know it, was when gold was found in Montana, there was a natural movement of people from the eastern United States, white people from the eastern United States who wanted to get to the gold area. And you could go all the way along the railroad or all the way along the immigrant trail and then turn north and go up through Idaho, or you could cut straight across. And if you cut straight across, you followed what we came to know as the Bozeman Trail, but that went right through territory that the Lakota claimed. It also went right through territory that had formerly been Crow territory. Crows still wanted it, but they were having trouble fighting with the Lakota. Red Cloud was adamant that that territory was for his people, and he didn't want any white people coming into that area. Well, things go as they go. The white tribe is trying to prevent people from cutting straight up through there, but they really can't. In a nutshell, they just can't stop the flow. So they actually take a different stance and say, all right, we're going to put in a few forts that link this trail together and can protect the people going up this trail. Well, of course, Red Cloud and his people looked at it and went, that's just encroachment. You've just put forts in our zone. And this brought about Red Cloud's War, which was really a series of skirmishes that Red Cloud dominated in. Absolutely, the Lakota dominated in most of these things. One of them was the Fetterman fight. We talked briefly about that. There were a number of small engagements, but the Fetterman fight, up until the time of Custer, which we'll get to later, but up until the time of his demise, was the biggest loss of the white tribe's soldiers in any battle. And it was just an absolute, they were overrun. They rode right into an ambush. They were told not to do it. Fetterman rode right out into it, and everybody got killed. But it's interesting to note, it's important to note, that what was happening here was there was an encroachment on what had been the Lakota territory for 100 years or so. Prior to that, there had been an encroachment by the Lakota into Crow territory. And the Lakota were even beginning to encroach on the Shoshone territory. So there was this division. Well, at the time also, something to think about, the United States had just come out of the bloodiest war to that time in history. And it was by far and away the worst thing that had happened to young America, young United States. Civil War was a horrible event, and not only that, it wasn't just absolutely over. It did come to an end, but the North had to worry there might be another uprising in the South. So a lot of the troops that might have been sent out to fight Red Cloud were sent to Richmond, Virginia. They were sent to Savannah, Georgia. They were occupying the South to make sure there was not another uprising. The other thing that was going on was the United States just did not want to fight. We had just been through it. We didn't want to send more sons into battle. And so whilst Red Cloud came up with some very ingenious tactics, and I'll get on that in a second, he also was up against an enemy that was not throwing everything it could into the game and into the fight. And he still had some great tactics. He did things where he would draw in, as he did with Fetterman, create create a situation that the soldiers would feel the need that they had to fight. They would come into an area, and he was very good at using terrain to basically trap his enemy and then decimate him. And a lot of his tactics from horses too were very similar to the tactics, and he could have never known this, very similar to things that the Mongols used when they were expanding across Asia. So I think my father told me this many years ago, that he had been in a military high school, Culver Military Academy, and they had taught a class his senior year on great tacticians, and it was 20 great tacticians, and only 2 of them were Americans. One of them, I believe, was Stonewall Jackson, and the other one was Red Cloud. So he was a very good tactician, very good fighter, and eventually these forts that were along the Bozeman Trail got removed. They were out in an area that we just could not protect. The Americans, white tribe, could not protect, and Lakota won. They truly won. The first war that the United States lost was to Red Cloud. Interestingly, Red Cloud realized that he was not going to, this wasn't the end of it. Yes, I won this war, but this isn't the end. You're going to keep coming this way. I know you're going to keep putting pressure on. And there was a strong movement in the eastern United States, especially among Republicans, to recognize the culture of the Plains Indians and to acknowledge that they should have these large areas where they could live the way they wanted to live. And Red Cloud was invited on a speaking tour of the eastern United States, various cities, and he and I believe it was Spotted Tail went on this tour and spoke to crowds and actually met with the president. Didn't get very far with President Grant, but he did meet with him about things and say, look, I want my people to have this. And I think I might have gone into this in previously, but the one thing he got out of it was, how did we win this war? We can at best, if we united a whole bunch of tribes, get the Cheyenne together, get the Lakota and the various other Sioux tribes all together at once, we might put 5,000 men on the field of battle. And the Great Father, this American army, can lose 15,000 people in one day and still fight the next day. He said, we can't win like this, so we're gonna have to win through negotiations. And it's interesting to see that this great warrior, this man who clearly understood tactics, went to the east and he saw these giant buildings and he saw trains that ran everywhere. He saw cities with nearly 1 million people in them. He was like, that's it. We won once, we're not gonna win again. Let's try and find a peaceful way to do this. And for the rest of his life, he was for a peaceful solution. This is a very interesting point because now you have what is essentially a division in the Lakota. The Lakota then had members of their tribe, like for instance Crazy Horse, who'd never been back east and said, well, it worked before fighting, I say we keep fighting. Whereas Red Cloud, still staunchly wanting to hold his territory, said, no, we will not win. And over the long haul, through the 1870s, these divisions in the Native Americans would be exacerbated as best as they could by the white tribe's military. Also, white tribe military started getting a little bit better. Now there have been men who were like William Sherman, who had been very much tested in battle in the eastern United States. Sheridan, very much tested in battle, and had been through this horrible war and came out of it saying, all right, war is hell, as Sherman's famous saying, but you get that hell over with as soon as possible. So there were divisions happening within the Native Americans, and there was a more uniting time coming for the for the white tribe, for the United States Cavalry and Army. But Red Cloud won his war. So that's in one side of the state. On the other side of the state, you have the Shoshone that are occasionally getting attacked by Lakota. They're regularly getting attacked by Blackfeet, and they're all but at war with the Crow. The Crow War was somewhat settled over the Wind River Valley with the battle at Crowheart Butte. But it was clear to Washakie that the best direction for him was to side with the white tribe. And it was clear to the Crow, the best direction for us is to side with the white tribe. Which now, you got two guys that don't like each other, but they were actually getting involved in some of the battles. They were assisting during Red Cloud's War, assisting these United States cavalry units and telling them, giving them ideas on how the Lakota would attack, how the Cheyenne attack, and so forth. And they would go on into the 1870s to be a major assistance and to be a part of all of the battles that were coming up. We've had the country united, and we have this area in Wyoming where there are some tribes which are hostile to Western expansion. None of them want Western expansion of the white tribe, but some of them are a little bit more forgiving than others. But the white tribes during Lincoln's tenure as presidency had come up with this plan for the West, among a number of plans, but one of them was the Homestead Act, which was a series of acts, but the main point of the Homestead Act was to grant land to people who could file for it for a minimal charge. They could get a small section of land, basically is it a mile by a mile? And it was enough land that it had been deemed a family could survive on. And then there were a few other acts that happened that you could get it up to 1,200 acres roughly. The idea for Lincoln was we want to make farms available. We don't want them to be big enough farms that you have to have slaves. We want to be able to do it with what we see as the future of labor, which is you working on your own farm. You don't try and get a big farm going where you have thousands of people out there working. So there were people coming out now on the train, some coming out on wagons, some coming in the train, and no longer going all the way to the coast, but going, well, there's stream systems and there's lush areas in this place, like for instance in Wyoming, where it's kind of a hard place to live, but you can eke out a living and you don't have to pay a large sum to get the land. So people started filing for homesteads, and that again is encroaching on the resources of these people who are living there, and they now have reservation areas that are being set aside, but those reservation areas, the buffalo aren't as plentiful. They're no longer able to just wander where they want off the reservation, for instance, to follow the buffalo herd. They've got to stay in a more fixed spot, and as a hunter-gatherer, that's not working. The military says, all right, we're going to start giving you more supplies. They've already said this in the past, but they say we're going to keep that going on. And sometimes they come through with it, sometimes they don't come through with it. But these people are in a harder place. One group in particular that was in a tough spot was the Shoshone. However, because the Shoshone had assisted the white tribe in its wars with Red Cloud and the Lakota, they got a pretty favorable position, one might say. Perhaps not what they would have wanted originally, of course, but they had a fairly large section of the middle of Wyoming was declared the Shoshone Reservation. And the centerpiece of it was our area here, the Wind River Valley, which they had to be fighting over for years with the Crow for it. And the Crow had recognized at that battle of Crowheart Butte that they would that would be Shoshone territory, and now the white tribe recognized that's going to be Shoshone territory. The Crow were granted a reservation up in Montana, but they were still having to fight with the Lakota. The wars with the Lakota between the Crow never came to an end, and there was still this constant antagonism between various travelers of moving into the West, now some homesteaders getting very close to what was deemed Lakota territory, and even looking into Lakota territory. A couple things happened here that really re-upped the war after Red Cloud's War with the Lakota. One was Custer, who was a flamboyant guy, who was loved by the press, pretty man, long blonde hair, and dressed the part of being Western guy, didn't wear what he was supposed to wear by military rules, just wanted to look like, he was out for his fame. Custer put together an expedition and under, I believe it was under Sheridan, went into the Black Hills. The Black Hills were the very center of the Lakota territory. And he went in there with ostensibly the idea was find a place to put a fort for us to be giving out our, doing the allocations of stuff for the Lakota that we have promised we would do for them. We would do it out of that fort. However, there was also the idea of, well, maybe we're going to take more land from them too. We could have this fort and we can take the land. So Custer brought miners with him and press people. And they found about that much gold, but immediately told the world when they left, there's gold in the Black Hills, there's gold in the hills, that's where it came from. And all of a sudden, there were thousands of would-be miners wanting to get to the Black Hills, which was the center of Lakota territory. That just lit off the war again in full scale with the Lakota. Battles have taken place here and there, and I'm just going to cut right through it. What really happened was we didn't completely commit. Grant even told the miners they couldn't go into, he tried to restrict anyone from going into Lakota territory. No one was listening. And in 1876, we put together, we being the United States, a few groups of military might, that being cavalry units coming from western Montana, northern Montana, and North Dakota, and Fort Laramie. And had them go converge in on the northern Powder River Basin, so northern Wyoming, northeastern Wyoming. And in doing so, some battles were fought, one of which was the Battle of Tongue River. The Battle of Tongue River, Cook was the general there. He was terrified by the tactics he was having to deal with from the Lakota. He'd never seen anything like that. He'd just come out of the Civil War and was like, I was not expecting it like this. Cook kind of pulled back into the Bighorn Range after that battle ended. Meanwhile, this other force came down south, led by Custer. And Custer was warned by his Crow scouts, you don't want to go into this area here. There are way too many warriors. Custer only had a few hundred cavalrymen with him, but he went in anyway. His tactics were the usual tactics of try and go right to the middle of the Lakota village, and he did that, or tried to do that, but was decimated. He was wiped out. And what really happened with Custers Death was the press blew it up. Now the guy they loved, the guy they always followed and always had neat pictures and neat stories, and they could get a good quote out of him. Now he had been killed by the Lakota. And when that happened, the gloves came off. suddenly there was the Indian problem that had to be fixed. And it was really only within about 6 months that all of the Lakota, but really 2 bands of them, were wound up and put on their various reservations. The Crow got onto their reservation and were fairly content with that. The Shoshone had their reservation. Now there were reservations. And outside of Wyoming, to the north of Wyoming, 2 groups of Lakota still tried to maintain their ability to wander, but and to be nomads and to live off the reservation. Of note was Sitting Bull's group, and they went all the way north and crossed into Montana, but then found living in Montana was even harder than living here. So they came back south, and pretty quickly they were on the reservation as well. And that was basically the end of the Indian Wars. Everything else that has gone on since then was done through treaty and negotiation, purchasing, some outright taking of the land. But when Custer was killed and the press suddenly turned on the Native Americans, even the Northeast press, where this idea of protecting Plains Indian culture was being supported, no, not anymore. And those reservations, the Lakota reservation that had once been the entire northeast corner of Wyoming and the entire southeast corner of Montana and all of eastern South Dakota, that was shrunk down to some much smaller reservations that actually weren't that much different than what they have today. Nothing like this large section of the middle of the United States that was going to be their territory. It was over with. With that, suddenly there's a whole bunch of land that's now available for more homesteading. So homesteaders started moving in, started finding places along the Powder River, started finding places along in the Bighorn Basin that were no longer, was there the Indian threat. Now you could move in and have your little farm for a minimal amount of money and live out your life without having to worry about that previous threat. The next threat coming was from your own tribe. So by 1878, the Indian problem is pretty much over with. The West is now ripe for the Central West, not the Far West, which has already had its influx along the immigrant trail and so forth. Oregon Territory, California, that's already been, we're starting to fill into the middle of the country. And that area that had been wild there for a while, where you had to worry that you might be attacked by Cheyenne or Lakota or something, that's pretty much over with by the end of the 1870s. And the Homestead Act is now an important part of the growth of Wyoming. Homestead Act, through a couple of different variants of it. The initial one allowed you basically 64 acres, but you could expand and expand and expand with some various laws of it, and the biggest you could possibly get was about 1,200 acres. The idea behind it had been that it would be a small enough farm that you, out in the West, that you didn't need to have slaves. That had been with the initial part of the Homestead Act from the Lincoln administration, was we didn't want the ability for plantations to begin. Well, you could get a fairly large chunk of land and a family could have a small business going. The average was, I think, a 64 acre lot, but you could get up to 1,200 acres. And in the early 1880s, homesteads were being purchased in Cheyenne, but some of the land that was getting homesteaded, if you were a cattleman, you might have purchased land from a number of homesteaders, okay? You might even create homesteads that didn't exist. The cattleman could go to somebody in Philadelphia and hire them to sign a document saying, I am homesteading this land, get all the 1,200 acres or whatever. They never even came out west, but they signed the document. Then the cattleman pays the would-be homesteader for it, and he starts using it. And he links together a bunch of sections. And you can link together sections like the Swans did, Swan Brothers in southern Wyoming, where right along the railroad, where the railroad had been granted these large chunks of land along the tracks, you could buy up those. And you could get these fairly large sections of land that were good for large cattle operations. Then there were the sections of land that did not have homesteaders. Those sections nobody was using. In the early 1880s, you could let your cows wander on your land. They could wander onto what was open range and use the open range. You go 5-6 years of using open range, you start to get used to using that range for your cows. You start to run your operation with enough cows that they always get to water on the open range as well as on your land. But then all of a sudden somebody might show up, ride in with their wagon, a couple of horses, a couple of cows, and start building a cabin right there where you normally put your cows. And you don't own the land, and they've got a document that says they're homesteading it. You can see now you're starting to get a place where these big cattle ranchers would be perhaps a little bit upset with these small-time homesteaders. And the homesteaders would arrive, the cattlemen would say, no, you got to get out of here, this is mine. I said, no, I've got a bill of sale right here from the Homestead Act, and I signed it down in Cheyenne, it's mine. Fights would evolve. This continued well into the end of the 1880s, and then there's some very large cattle ranches being operated, and in I believe the winter of 1888, huge dive in the cattle industry. There was a horrible winter. It killed maybe hundreds of thousands of cattle in Wyoming. Homesteaders weren't hurt as bad as the large cattle operations because they being smaller, they could bring their herd in near, they could get to their animals and bring them maybe around the barn, and they could do a better job of caring for a smaller number of animals, whereas the big operations were used to just having them wander and the animals would make it through the winter and so forth. Well, that winter, maybe 50% of the cattle herd didn't survive. And those that did survive came out of it really skinny and not worth a lot. So not only did you have a smaller number of cattle that could be taken to market, but you had much less valuable cattle that those cattle weren't worth as much. So these cattle ranchers were losing money and they didn't know what they could do. And one of the things they came up with was, let's form our own group that can fight for our rights. And one of the things they didn't like that they could fight for was an end to what was known as cattle rustling, the stealing of cattle. And there are a number of things that go into it. There really wasn't that much cattle rustling going on. If you were on the scale of a large rancher, you were losing far less cattle to rustling than you were to, say, the weather. But it was something you could control. You couldn't control the weather. And at the same time, you were having this problem with this homesteading group coming in and chopping up what had been the open range and making it suddenly areas that you couldn't run your cattle on because somebody had a bill of sale saying that was their land now. So these were two things that the large scale cattle operations felt they could control by forming their own large union of essentially the wealthiest, most powerful men in Wyoming. And it started as the Laramie or the Albany County Stock Growers Association and then became the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. And you basically were in a club. If you were in the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, you were in a who's who of Wyoming. You were in a little club that only let in its friends, and they were all the wealthiest, most powerful men, and they were trying to do things to help out the large cattle industry. We'll just jump right now to what was going on in the late 1880s, early 1890s with these homesteaders. Homesteaders would have a group of cowboys maybe ride up and say, you know what, we don't like where you've put your homestead and we're gonna mess with it. Either get out of here or we're gonna mess with it. Come back the next week, homesteaders still like, this is my land. Well, these cowboys go through, they got guns and you got guns, but you're outnumbered, and they knock down all your fencing and they may even torch your barn, might shoot an animal or something. All of a sudden, you're uncomfortable there. It's not working. You've lost your crop. You move on and you just abandon that homestead. And now that large cattle operation has it. That was going on quite a bit. That's how the infamous Cattle Kate, who was certainly in a modern court, if you were to take a look at her, you would not find that she was a cattle rustler. You would not find that she was a prostitute. None of these things would be able to be proven in a modern court, but that was how she was labeled by these cattle rustlers, or by these cattlemen. And she was famously hung along with her husband, actually her boyfriend, but they'd been together for years. She was hung because she had a homestead where a rancher was used to having his cattle go. And this happened in a number of cases around Wyoming. The thing would be blamed on rustling, but the problems of the cattlemen would be blamed on rustling, but it wasn't rustling that was really their problem. The weather was their problem. The biggest problem, though, was these homesteads popping up. So what they would call getting rid of rustlers was also the getting rid of homesteads. This peaked. It really had two peaks, but the biggest peak, I would say, was the Johnson County War, where a guy named Walcott, one of the members of the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association, he fancied himself a military man, had everybody call him the Major. He put together this plan where the governor endorsed it, where he would take a group of men hired out of Texas, and they would ride north, they'd go up to Johnson County, and they were going to go after some particular people. Two cowboys in particular who had tried to unite the cowboys in a union were also now homesteading. So these guys were real bad news. They were trying to make it so that the cowboys all over at all the different Wyoming cattle ranches could be, they could form their own contracts. They could ask for higher wages, and they could all go on strike if they wanted to. Not a popular idea with the big cattle ranchers, and now they had this homestead too. No indication that these gentlemen had ever been cattle rustlers, but they were accused of it. So this guy Walcott puts together this thing. They go up on the train, the new train route that runs from Cheyenne to Casper. They get out of the train in Casper, and they ride through a snowstorm, and they get up to these ranches in the southern part of Johnson County. Push comes to shove, they kill these guys, and then they go off to a friend's place. They cut the transmission lines for the, on the way up, they had cut the transmission lines of the telegraph because they didn't want the people in Johnson County to call the governor and tell him. Now, the governor knew these kinds of things were going to be going on, but they didn't want the governor to be put in a place where he would have to send up some guys to stop this Wyoming stockgrowers group from getting rid of these rustlers. So these guys hole up there for a day, and then the next day they find out they're surrounded by the people of Johnson County who are going to kill them. And all of these Texas guns and Walcott are holed up in a little cabin, and it's just getting riddled with bullets. They get somebody out. Somehow he gets through in the middle of the night, tries to get to the telegraph station. What cables have been cut? Gets to another spot. They cut their own way of getting out of there. He radios to the governor. The governor then radios to the president, telegraphs to the president. I need the military to go in and save my friends. Military does come in, reluctantly lets these Texans off. A few people died, but not many. The Texans get taken out of there, and Walcott get taken out of there. They get taken down to Cheyenne, and it's there's a farce of a trial. None of them are found guilty of anything. They're all let go, but there has been now a political scandal with the governor of Wyoming involved. The president was brought into it. The senators from Wyoming were brought into it, and they all look bad. And the guys in Washington didn't even know what had been going on with this stuff, but they were labeled with it. So this was pretty much the end of the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association being this good old boy club. All of a sudden, it had to open up its doors. This was a major part of law coming to the West. The second peak in this thing would have been the Tom Horn incident, which Tom Horn was a hired gun by some of the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association members. He'd gone around and had done some enforcing for them, and he got busted for something that he probably didn't do. This did not make him an innocent man. He had done a number of things, it appears, that were very bad in his life. However, he was hung for killing a kid named Willie Nichols, and he probably did not do that crime. But again, he had been hired to do some other enforcement stuff, and this put the bigwigs of Wyoming in a bad light. And with that, Wyoming Stockgrowers Association had to completely revamp itself, and it's still in existence, and it's a very good organization that represents basically anybody at any size of operation can be with the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association. It's no longer a good old boys club. But then back in the 1870s through the 1890s, it was a group that was set up to take care of the big guys. But a couple different things that put egg on the face of politicians, and the rule of law had to come to Wyoming. You could no longer just rule by being one of the wealthy ranchers. There were now going to be sheriffs that were elected, and those elected officials would report to other elected officials. And you now have a Wyoming where you have the actual rule of law. No longer wars going on, but actual outlaws, and the outlaws could be very wealthy men or they could be very poor men, but they were outlaws and gotten rid of. The period between 1860 and 1890 is incredibly important for Wyoming. And we've talked about Red Cloud's War, and we've talked about the various Indian wars, and we've talked about how the reservations came about and so forth. We talked about the Homesteading Act and how that influenced it, but something else Wyoming should be proud of is that the women have the vote. And that started in the United States in the territory, or actually the pre-territory of Wyoming. When we were becoming a territory, and that deserves its own little story here in a second. We were becoming a territory. There was a movement and all across the country for women to be given the right to vote, but it was heard loudest in Wyoming. One reason for that was there were not very many women in Wyoming. Men recognized if the women were allowed to vote, we'd have more women come here. Another was just the outright wrongness of it. Men who knew their wife was smarter than their neighbor would say, why shouldn't my wife be allowed to vote? That guy's a moron. So there was a movement to allow women the right to vote. It had its foundation in Wyoming in the town of South Pass, but there were other places like Laramie where there were women pushing for the right to vote, and of course men pushing for the right for women to vote. And when we were created into a territory, that was, I think it was the first or second law that was passed by the territorial government, was women shall be given the right to vote and to run for office. Now, Wyoming becoming territory, you need that quick little story in there. It was actually a proposition by a East Coast, I can't remember where he was representing. He was originally from Pennsylvania. He's an East Coast politician, senator from the East. He might have been representing Delaware, but he also might have been from Pennsylvania when he proposed it. But he proposed Wyoming be a territory with the shape that Wyoming currently has. It looks like it's a square, but it's not. It's more of a trapezoid. And he couldn't come up with a name of this territory. And, Lakota wasn't going to be a very good name. That wasn't very popular out there. In fact, you probably couldn't name it after any of the tribes, even though probably our best, the name that was the most correct to me would be Washakie, or the other name would be Bridger. He didn't know the history of the area. He didn't really know the place. He just wanted a bill to put out there and say, all right, this is going to be its own territory. And with nothing else to go on, he said, well, we'll name it after the valley I was born in. The Wyoming Valley. It's a Delaware Indian word, Wyoming is, and it means open plain. We don't know if he even knew that, but it's a Delaware Indian word that was taken from his birthplace. So we became the territory of Wyoming in 1869, and we were on our way towards statehood, but that was a ways down the road. Women had the right to vote in the state election, or the territorial elections, and that carried on through the 1880s, and then in the 1890s, late 1880s, there was starting to be a movement for us to have statehood rather than territoryness. We would have more representation that way and more self-governance. Statehood did come fairly easily in 1890, and with that, the law giving women the right to vote was reaffirmed. It was put into the state government's first rules. Women shall have the right to vote and the right to run for office. And it would be another 33 years or so before women in the rest of the country had it, in the entire country. I believe actually Utah was the second state to grant suffrage, but Wyoming was way ahead of the rest of the country. So Wyoming is now a state, and there's this rule of law, but there are a few people who didn't necessarily follow the law. There weren't the so-called gunfights and so forth taking place that you see. Those did happen, but it was not a very commonplace. The average person just wanted to get by on their homestead, or get by working as a cattle rancher or a cowboy, or maybe even work in a small store in a town or a saloon in town. They're just trying to get by. But there were these occasional people who wanted to make something off of those guys. One guy who moved to Rock Springs, his name was Bob Parker. He always had a spare cow. Even though he didn't own a cattle ranch or a homestead, he always had a spare cow to give to the local market at a good price. And he eventually took a job at that local market, and everybody began to call him Butch because he was the butcher at the local market. And he changed his last name to Cassidy. Okay, Butch Cassidy is his name, not Bob Parker. And Butch then later moved to Lander, and he'd been a cowpoke. He'd working on cattle farms, and he then became a butcher. And when he was in Lander, he put $15,000 in Eugene Amoretti's bank. By far, I believe at the time, he was by far the largest holder or depositor in the bank. And it's a lot of money for a guy who was a butcher and a cowboy. But nobody's going to ask any questions. It's money going in the bank. And he was a very nice guy, and everybody liked him. Well, it turns out Butch had robbed the San Miguel Bank a few years back in Telluride, and he needed a place, Telluride, Colorado, and he needed a place to put the money. And Eugene Amoretti's bank in this remote town of Lander, Wyoming was a perfect place for it. Butch moved on. He moved up to Du Bois. He had a little homestead up there along Horse Creek. But he didn't like to stay in there any place for very long, and he moved away from there. Butch went out to the east into the Bighorn Basin, and he was out there one day riding, and he got arrested for having stolen horses. And he had paid for the horses. He said they were very cheap, but I paid for them. But the horses were proven to be that of a larger rancher in the area, and Butch had to go to jail, and he went to jail. He was told he had to be in Lander in on a given morning. He was there. He went out to the bar the night before, but then he surrendered to the police the next morning, was taken down to Laramie. At that time, the state penitentiary was in Laramie, not in Rawlins. And he was doing his time. The judge who sentenced Butch to, everybody liked the man. He was very nice, even though there were some stories that maybe he had stolen some cattle in the past, and maybe he'd even robbed a bank in Colorado. Everybody liked him. And the judge liked him in particular and said, there's some holes in the story of the prosecutor, and revisited the whole thing, and then went to the governor and said, Governor, I think we've got a man in jail that's not supposed to be in jail. I don't know if this Butch Cassidy guy is, wholesome, but I don't think he stole those horses. So the governor agreed, you know what? I agree with what you've come up with here. I'm going to pardon him, but I want a verbal promise from him he will never break the law in Wyoming, because it doesn't look like maybe he's the best guy in the world. He's just not guilty of this crime. So they got that. Butch told the governor, I will never commit a crime in Wyoming. And he was released from prison. Well, he made a lot of friends in prison, and he already knew some people from years back that made money in a way that was unscrupulous, I would say, robbing people and stealing cattle and so forth. Well, he went back to his old ways. He just didn't do it in Wyoming. So he robbed a mining organization in Utah. He robbed a bank in southeast Idaho. He might have robbed another bank in northern Colorado. And he did this with a group of people that was a varying group. They got known as the Wild Bunch. Now, the Wild Bunch, we kind of think of them like out of the movie in Tombstone, the cowboys in Tombstone. They're just a bunch of tough guys that go riding around and beating people up. And nah, not so much. The Wild Bunch did have some fairly mean characters, Matt Warner of them, but by and large, the Wild Bunch just committed their few crimes. We don't know of anyone being shot by, for instance, Butch and Sundance ever. Doesn't appear that either one of them had ever shot anybody. If they did, Sundance never went to jail or anything for it. And the rest of the Wild Bunch, what they would do is they'd ride into a bank or whatever, and they'd fire their guns, or they would just intimidate everybody. And nobody wanted to get shot. They'd give them the money, ride out, and that'd be that. And this was going on outside of Wyoming, these places outside of Wyoming. And then the Wild Bunch would come back in, and they got their name because they'd throw a giant party. And there were certain towns they'd throw parties in because they were looked upon favorably. See, at this time, if you were a sheriff, an elected sheriff in a small town in the West, you were pretty isolated. You might have a deputy and you might have friends around town, but if you had a group of people come in that were known, or maybe a real tough guy who you didn't want to scrap with, you had nobody to back you up if you wanted to go arrest him. So you'd often make these rules, like, for instance, in the town of Baggs, the town of Lander, Meeteetse, right outside of Meeteetse, a little town up there, Arnold, Jackson, Moab, Utah was this way, where the sheriff would say to a guy like Butch Cassidy and his friend, the Sundance Kid, I don't know what exactly you've done. I've got some flyers here to show you're kind of bad guys, but I don't know what you've done elsewhere, but if you don't break the law in my town, you're fine to stay here. So these became little safe enclaves for these guys. And the Wild Bunch would go into these towns after they'd robbed something and throw a giant party. And in Baggs, they threw one party where they had over a weekend, they had like $1,000 liquor bill or something, which was a lot of money for liquor back then. And everybody get stuff bought for them on the house and so forth. That's how they got the nickname, the Wild Bunch. And there were a number of people that were on the Wild Bunch, in the Wild Bunch, who maybe some of them would be involved in the bank thing in Utah or in southeast Idaho, and then another few of them would be involved in the thing in the mining around Price in Utah, and it was a varying group. Well, Butch was getting a bad reputation, but he wasn't breaking the law in Wyoming, so the governor wasn't out to get him. However, the Wild Bunch decided to rob a train outside the town of Tipton. Tipton doesn't really exist anymore. It's along I-80. Tipton was a refueling spot for, where you'd get water put in the trains, and coal put in the trains for the next leg. Roughly every 30 miles or so, you had these things across the southern part of Wyoming along the railroad. And one of them was Tipton. And it's out in the Red Desert. And they used too much dynamite when they tried to open up the safe. They blew a whole rail car up, injured some people and so forth, but they got the money out of it. However, Butch wasn't even there. Now, in the movie, Butch is there. Butch is the one who puts too much dynamite on it. But it appears now Butch was actually in Ely, Nevada at the time. And he was there on purpose. He probably even planned the Tipton deal, but he wasn't involved. The whole group of the Wild Bunch, they had some sort of organization of how they shared the money. They moved to, they all agreed they would meet a couple weeks later when there weren't posses chasing them. They agreed they would meet up in Pavilion, Wyoming, right outside of Lander. And Butch showed up there. And he got noticed as having been in the area. So even though he wasn't down at the Tipton fight, or at the Tipton robbery, he was involved in the distribution of the money. So with that, the railroad was done with him. They were done with him. The governor said, "This looks too bad. I think you're breaking the law," and that was it. Butch didn't have a safe place anymore. He and his friends had to get out of Wyoming. So the Sundance Kid, Harry Longbaugh, his girlfriend, Etta Place, and Butch, they separated from the rest of the group. Some of the group, a couple of them, two women, they just went back to their homestead in Du Bois, and Matt Werner went south, and the people went various ways. Butch went off to New York and lived the high life. He was a well-known character, but of course, we didn't have everybody's face. They didn't look all the. You didn't have the photographs and the clarity that you have now. So nobody thought he was anything other than a nice guy from the West who was touring around the sites and staying in the Waldorf Hotel and so forth in New York. They got on a boat and went to Argentina, and it appears they each bought ranches in Argentina, and they raised pigs. They had employees, and as far as we know, as far as we could prove in court, they never robbed anybody while they were down there. Now, there were other men down in Argentina and Bolivia and Peru who were robbing banks. And these were Yankees, these were Americans, possibly even other members of the Wild Bunch, but they had come down there and were robbing banks and so forth. And we don't know that Butch didn't, but he kind of didn't need to. He had a big farm operation going down there. Anyway, sorry about that. The authorities in the movie Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, they track these guys down to a bank in Bolivia, and where they're robbing it. The army surrounds them and kills them. Doesn't appear that happened. The army definitely surrounded and killed a couple of guys. But we have all these reports from the early 1900s of people who saw Butch Cassidy. At least 20 people wrote reports. Well, Butch was here. A couple people in Lander, a doctor in Lander noted that he had seen Butch, and a businessman over in Jackson. Butch came to visit a number of times. He drove a black Model T. He was always his happy self. Looked a little different, but it was Butch Cassidy. His niece, who was she was a young girl when she knew him, but he came every year. He came a number of times for reunions. And she claimed that he actually lived out his life till about 1927 in Spokane, Washington. And in that time, he made his visits down here, but he did not die at the hands of the Bolivian military. In the early 1990s, there was a group who decided they were going to find out for sure. And they went to this town in Bolivia, and it was recorded that the two men who had been shot by the military were buried in the cemetery outside of town in these 2 plots. Well, they got permission, they exhumed the graves, and they did some DNA testing. And what do you know? Bob Parker's DNA wasn't in either one of those bodies. 2 guys got shot for robbing a bank in Bolivia, but it wasn't Butch Cassidy, and thus probably also was not the Sundance Kid. It looks like they lived out their lives as decent people back in the United States. And with that,
Okay.